At 80 years old, I stopped trying to please everyone, and what happened next shocked me. Louis Green sat among the residents in the common room of the Miami nursing home, a polite smile plastered across his face. Around him, people chattered, laughed, and complimented him on his impeccable manners, his kind heart, his willingness to always say yes. But inside, Louis felt empty. Across the room, a man stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the room. He was tall, with graying hair and a tense, rigid posture. His gaze locked onto Louis, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. The man stepped forward, his jaw clenched, hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. He stopped in front of Louis, his eyes dark and unblinking. "I'm Jonathan," he said, his voice heavy and firm. "Your son." Louis's smile faltered. The room fell silent, and for the first time in decades, Louis couldn't find a single word to say. Louis sat alone in his room, the silence pressing down like a heavy shroud. The blinds were drawn, the air stale and unmoving. The nursing home felt colder now, as if the very walls had absorbed Jonathan's words and were now echoing them back at him. "I'm Jonathan, your son." The words played over and over in Louis's mind, each repetition a fresh stab of guilt. Jonathan, the son he had walked away from decades ago. The boy he had left standing alone in a diner parking lot, holding a backpack too big for his small shoulders. Louis rubbed his eyes, the memories surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. 40 years ago, Louis was a different man, a man in his prime, with slicked back hair and a crisp suit, always in a hurry to the next meeting, the next deal. He was a man driven by ambition and fueled by the desire to be respected, admired, and yes, loved. But his wife, Margaret, never seemed to understand that. She'd watch him from across the dinner table, her eyes dark and hollow. "You're always working," she'd say, her voice tinged with resentment. "Always somewhere else." Louis would dismiss her complaints with a wave of his hand. "I'm doing this for us, for Jonathan. You want a better life, don't you?" But Margaret didn't want more money or a bigger house. She wanted a husband. Jonathan wanted a father. And Louis was too busy chasing approval from everyone else to see the family he was losing right in front of him. It was a rainy afternoon when everything finally fell apart. Louis had been working late, again, and by the time he got home, Margaret was gone. The house was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of her perfume. A single note sat on the kitchen counter, written in her slanted, hurried handwriting. "I can't do this anymore. Jonathan and I are staying with my sister. If you care at all, you'll come find us." Louis read the note twice, then crumpled it in his fist. How dare she leave? How dare she take Jonathan? He was working for them, sacrificing for them. Didn't they see that? He grabbed his keys and stormed out, the engine of his car roaring to life as he sped down the highway, rain pelting the windshield like bullets. When he reached Margaret's sister's house, it was late. The porch light was off, the house dark and silent. Louis pounded on the door, his fists aching. "Margaret, open up!" But no one came to the door. He stood there, rain-soaked and shivering, his anger morphing into something darker, fear. The next morning, he went to Margaret's workplace. Her boss told him she'd quit. He drove to Jonathan's school, but the teacher said Jonathan hadn't been there in days. For weeks, Louis searched, calling everyone he knew, visiting every friend Margaret had ever mentioned. But it was as if they had vanished into thin air. Eventually, he gave up. He returned to his empty house, the rooms echoing with the sound of his own footsteps. And that's when the letters began. Louis sat at the kitchen table, the blank page staring back at him like an accusation. He picked up the pen, his hand trembling. What could he possibly say? How could he explain why he hadn't gone after them sooner? Why he hadn't dropped everything to find them? Dear Jonathan, I know you're angry. You have every right to be. I want you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. Never stopped loving you. I was just lost. But Louis never sent the letter. It sat on the table for weeks, the ink fading, the paper yellowing with age. And then, one day, he folded it up, placed it in a small wooden box, and shoved it to the back of the closet. Years passed. Louis threw himself deeper into his work, convincing himself that money and success would somehow fill the void Jonathan and Margaret had left behind. He became the man people relied on, the man who said yes to every request, every demand, every favor. But every year, on Jonathan's birthday, Louis would write another letter. Letters filled with apologies he could never bring himself to say aloud. Letters that spoke of the life he missed, the first day of school, the little league games, the high school graduation he never attended. Dear Jonathan, today you're 16. I wonder if you're driving now. Maybe you have a girlfriend. Maybe you're planning for college. I should have been there. I should have taught you how to drive. Should have warned you about girls like the one who broke my heart at 16. But I wasn't there. I'm still not. And I don't know how to change that. Each letter was a confession, a plea for forgiveness, a cry for redemption. And each letter was locked away in the same wooden box, the words gathering dust along with Louis's regrets. Now, decades later, Jonathan was back. Not the 8-year-old boy clutching a backpack, but a grown man with eyes full of anger and resentment. And Louis had nothing to say, not a single word. Because the truth was, he didn't know why he had left. He didn't know why he hadn't fought harder to find them, to bring them home. Maybe he was a coward. Maybe he was selfish. Maybe he had convinced himself that they were better off without him. And maybe he had been wrong. Louis stood up, his knees wobbling, and crossed the room to the closet. He pulled the wooden box from the back of the shelf, the lid creaking as he opened it. The letters stared back at him, a stack of yellowed pages covered in ink smudged by tears. With shaking hands, he pulled out the first letter, the one he had written the day after Margaret left. The ink was faded, the words barely legible, but he could still make out the first line. Dear Jonathan, I'm sorry. Louis sank onto the bed, the letter clutched to his chest. The words swam before his eyes, the ink blurring into dark smears. Outside, the sky darkened, thunder rumbling in the distance. Rain began to fall, pattering against the window like 1,000 tiny fists. The sound filled the room, drowning out the silence, the emptiness, the years of words left unsaid. And somewhere in this building, Jonathan was waiting. Waiting for the father who had abandoned him. Waiting for answers Louis still couldn't give. Louis closed his eyes, the letter crumpled in his fist. He had written so many words. But now, when it mattered most, he didn't know how to say them. The rain continued to pour as Louis sat slumped on the edge of the bed, the letter crumpled in his fist. The ink smudged against his palm, staining his skin with words he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. The wooden box lay open beside him, the rest of the letters scattered across the bedspread like fallen leaves. Each page bore a date, a memory, a failed attempt to bridge the gap between a father who couldn't stay and a son who couldn't forget. But now Jonathan was here, and every unsent letter was a reminder of what Louis had lost, and what he might never get back. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Louis's heart thudded against his chest. Was it Jonathan? Had he come back to demand answers, to scream at him, to finally unleash years of resentment that Louis had avoided for far too long? Louis forced himself to stand, his knees trembling. "Come in," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. The door swung open, and Mary stepped inside, her expression tight with concern. "Louis." Louis's shoulders slumped, relief and disappointment crashing together. "Oh, it's you." Mary stepped forward, her eyes scanning the mess of letters strewn across the bed. "I just saw Jonathan downstairs," she said softly. "He looked upset." Louis swallowed, his throat tight. "What did he say?" Mary shook her head, her gaze drifting to the open box. "Nothing. He just stormed out into the rain. Didn't even take an umbrella." Louis's jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. "Of course he did. Why would he stay? Why would he even want to look at me?" Mary stepped closer, her hand resting on the back of the chair. "What did you say to him?" Louis let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow. "Nothing. I didn't say a damn thing. I couldn't. I just sat there, staring at him like a fool." Mary's eyes softened. "Louis, he's here. After all these years, he came to find you. That has to mean something." Louis shook his head, his jaw clenched. "It means he wants to punish me. He wants me to see what I did to him, how I ruined his life." Mary's brows knit together. Or maybe he just wants to hear the truth. Louis turned away, his gaze falling to the rain-soaked window. Outside, the courtyard was empty, the benches glistening under the relentless downpour. The world looked blurred, smudged, as if everything was falling apart and melting into nothingness. "How do I tell him the truth?" Louis muttered, his voice cracking. "How do I look my own son in the eye and tell him that I was too scared, too selfish, too weak to be his father?" Mary's hand moved to his shoulder, squeezing gently. "You start with the truth, and you keep telling it until there's nothing left to say." Louis swallowed, his throat burning. But what if he doesn't want to hear it? What if it's too late? Mary's eyes glistened. "It's only too late if you don't try." Mary left, the door clicking softly behind her. Louis remained where he was, staring at the closed door, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The room felt colder now, the silence heavier, the air thick with unspoken words. Louis turned back to the bed, his eyes falling on the scattered letters. He reached down, picking up the letter he had started years ago, the one meant for Jonathan's 18th birthday. The ink was faded, the paper wrinkled and worn. "Dear Jonathan, today, you're 18, a man, and I missed it. I missed everything. I know you must hate me. I would hate me too. But I still think about you every day. I still see your face, the way you looked at me that day in the parking lot. I promised I'd come back. I lied. You have every right to hate me. But if you're reading this, if you somehow still care enough to read my words, then maybe we still have a chance." Louis crumpled the letter in his fist, the tears streaming down his face. The words blurred, the ink bleeding into his skin. He dropped the letter, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. An hour passed, maybe more. The rain finally stopped, and the silence in the room felt deafening. Louis sat motionless, staring at the letters littering the floor, each one a monument to every missed moment, every unspoken apology. The door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't Mary. Jonathan stood in the doorway, his shirt soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes were red, his jaw clenched tight. In his hand, he held one of the letters, the very first one Louis had written the day after he left. "Is this all you have to say?" Jonathan demanded, holding the letter aloft. His hand trembled, his knuckles white. "You wrote these instead of just coming to find me?" Louis opened his mouth, but no words came. He felt like he was drowning, the air thick and heavy in his lungs. Jonathan took a step forward, his eyes blazing. "You wrote letters? You think that's enough? Do you have any idea what it was like for me? For Mom?" Louis's fists clenched at his sides. "I know I was wrong. I know I should have come back. But I was scared. I was scared." Jonathan spat. "You think you're the only one who was scared? I was 8 years old. I sat in that diner parking lot for hours, waiting for you to come back. Mom kept telling me you were just running late, but I knew you weren't coming back." Louis's breath hitched. "Jonathan, don't say you're sorry." Jonathan's voice cracked, and his eyes filled with tears. "Sorry doesn't fix anything. Sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent wondering why my father didn't love me enough to stay." Louis's knees buckled, and he dropped into the chair, his face buried in his hands. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Jonathan stood there, chest heaving, his fists still clenched. "I don't want your letters," he said, his voice low and raw. "I don't want your apologies. I just want to know why." Louis lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot, his face wet with tears. "Because I didn't know how to be a father," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to stay. So, I ran." Jonathan's jaw clenched, the tears spilling over. "And now?" Louis swallowed, his throat raw. Now I'm trying to learn how to stay." Jonathan's eyes held his for a moment longer, a moment that felt like a lifetime. Then he dropped the letter onto the floor, turned around, and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. Louis sat alone, the silence pressing in, the letter lying at his feet like a fallen soldier. Jonathan was gone. Again. And Louis was still here, still trying to find the words that would make his son believe him. The door slamming echoed through the hallway, a sharp, cutting sound that lingered in the air like a haunting refrain. Louis remained frozen in the chair, his hands still shaking from the confrontation. The room felt colder now, emptier, as if Jonathan had sucked all the oxygen out of it when he left. The crumpled letter lay on the floor, the ink smudged from the rain and Jonathan's grip. Louis stared at it, his eyes burning. It was the first letter he'd ever written to Jonathan, the one he'd written the day after he left. The ink was faded, the paper yellowed, but the words still cut as deep as they had the day he wrote them. "Dear Jonathan, I'm sorry." 2 words. 2 pathetic, useless words. What was he expecting? That a simple apology would erase decades of pain? That one letter, or 1,000, would make up for a lifetime of absence? Louis swallowed, the guilt rising like bile in his throat. Jonathan's words echoed in his mind, each one a fresh stab of pain. "You think writing letters makes up for walking away?" Hours passed. The sky outside darkened, the rain tapering off into a slow, steady drizzle. Louis remained in the chair, his eyes fixed on the window, watching the drops slide down the glass like tears. His mind wandered back to that day in the diner parking lot. The day he promised Jonathan he'd come back. The memory was a razor blade, each detail slicing deeper than the last. It was a Saturday morning, the sun low in the sky, the air tinged with the scent of fresh coffee and wet asphalt. Jonathan sat in the back seat, his small hands clutching the backpack he insisted on bringing everywhere, the one with the broken zipper and the Spider-Man patch that Margaret had sewn on. Louis had parked the car outside the diner, the engine idling as he stared straight ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His heart pounded, the sound filling his ears. He could feel Jonathan's eyes on him, could feel the question hanging heavy in the air. Are we going to see Mom now? Louis forced a smile that felt like it would crack his face in two. Yeah, buddy. We just need to get some breakfast first. Jonathan nodded, his little face scrunched up in confusion. But I'm not hungry. Louis swallowed, his throat tight. I am. They went inside, sat at a booth by the window. Jonathan fidgeted with the salt shaker, eyes darting around the room. Louis ordered coffee, black, his stomach churning. The waitress brought the coffee, gave Jonathan a sad smile. You want some pancakes, sweetie? Jonathan shook his head, his eyes dropping to the table. The waitress left. Louis took a sip of coffee, the bitterness burning his tongue. He couldn't look at Jonathan. Couldn't look at the boy who still trusted him, who still believed that his father was coming back. Buddy, Louis said, his voice thick, I need you to stay here for a bit. I have to go. Take care of something. Jonathan's eyes widened. But you said we were going to see Mom. Louis forced another smile, his jaw aching. We are. I just need to get something from the car. You stay here, okay? I'll be right back. Jonathan nodded, his little shoulders slumping. Okay. Louis stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He walked to the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped outside, the sound a knife slicing through the air. He kept walking. Past the car. Past the parking lot. Past the street corner. He kept walking until he couldn't hear Jonathan's voice calling after him anymore. Now, decades later, that same voice echoed in his mind. Older, angrier, filled with a hurt that Louis had created. You think writing letters makes up for walking away? Louis rubbed his eyes, his hands trembling. He needed to do something. Needed to say something. But what? He glanced at the crumpled letter on the floor, the words blurred and bleeding into the paper. There were so many more letters. Letters he'd written, for every missed birthday, every missed Christmas, every missed milestone. What good were they now? A knock at the door snapped him back to the present. Louis jerked upright, his heart pounding. Was it Jonathan? Had he come back? But when the door opened, it was Mary. Her face was pinched with concern, her brow furrowed. Louis. Louis sank back in the chair, his shoulders slumping. He's gone, he said, his voice hollow. Mary stepped inside, her gaze flicking to the scattered letters on the floor. What happened? Louis shook his head, his throat tight. I tried to talk to him, but he didn't want to hear it. He thinks I'm just some old man who writes stupid letters instead of being a father. Mary bent down, picking up one of the letters. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. You wrote all of these for him? Louis nodded, the tears welling up again. Every year, every birthday, every Christmas, but I never sent them. I just kept them, like that would make up for everything. Mary's eyes softened, and she placed the letter on the table, her hand resting over his. Louis, it's not too late. He's still here. You can still talk to him. Louis pulled his hand away, shaking his head. He doesn't want to talk to me. I could see it in his eyes. He hates me. Mary's jaw tightened. Maybe he does. But maybe he also came here because he wants to understand. Maybe he's waiting for you to tell him the truth. Louis swallowed, the guilt choking him. I don't know how, he whispered. I don't know where to start. Mary leaned forward, her eyes intense. Then start with the one thing you haven't said yet, the truth. Not the excuses, not the apologies, just the truth. Louis blinked, the tears spilling over now. What if he doesn't forgive me? Mary squeezed his hand, her grip firm and steady. Then at least you'll know you tried. Louis sat alone after Mary left, the rain tapping softly against the window. He reached for the letter on the floor, his hands shaking. The ink was smeared, the words barely legible. But it didn't matter. None of those words mattered. Not anymore. Louis grabbed a fresh sheet of paper, picked up the pen, and took a deep breath. This time, he wouldn't write what he thought Jonathan wanted to hear. He wouldn't write what he thought would make things right. He would write the truth. Jonathan, I left you because I was a coward. I told myself it was for you, but it wasn't. It was for me. I was scared. Scared of being a failure. Scared of not being enough. Scared that you'd see right through me and hate me for the man I really was. And I was right. You do hate me. And I don't blame you. But I'm still here. And if you can find it in your heart to talk to me, I promise I'll stay this time. Love, Dad. Louis set the pen down, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. The room was silent now, but for the first time, it didn't feel empty. For the first time, Louis felt like he had finally said what he needed to say. Louis sat at the small table, staring at the letter he had just written. The ink was still wet, the words smudging slightly under his trembling fingertips. The room was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and fading hope. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the sky a dull gray canvas. The sound of water dripping from the eaves echoed through the nursing home, each drop a slow, deliberate beat. Louis picked up the letter, holding it up to the light. The words blurred, his vision clouded by unshed tears. This was it. This was everything he had never said. The truth, raw and unvarnished. No apologies, no excuses. Just the brutal, painful truth. But would Jonathan read it? Would he care? Louis folded the letter, slipping it into a plain white envelope. His fingers shook as he wrote Jonathan's name on the front. He stared at it for a long moment, then set it down on the table, his shoulders slumping. What now? Was this enough? Would anything ever be enough? Hours passed. The room darkened as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Louis remained in the chair, his gaze fixed on the envelope, his mind replaying every word he'd written. I left you because I was a coward. He could still hear Jonathan's voice, filled with anger and pain, echoing in his mind. You think writing letters makes up for walking away? Louis swallowed, his throat tight. What if Jonathan never came back? What if that brief heated exchange in the room was the last time he would ever see his son? Would he ever have the chance to say those words out loud? A knock at the door shattered the silence. Louis's heart leapt to his throat. Was it Jonathan? Was he back to scream at him, to throw the letter in his face, to finally unleash the rage he had been holding back for decades. Louis stood, his knees shaking, and opened the door. But it wasn't Jonathan. It was Mary. She stood in the doorway, her expression tight, eyes shadowed. "Louis," she said, stepping inside. "We need to talk." Louis's shoulders slumped. "He's gone, isn't he?" Mary nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He left." Louis closed his eyes, the air rushing from his lungs like a deflated balloon. "Did he say anything?" Mary hesitated, then shook her head. "Not to me. He just walked out, didn't look back." Louis turned away, his gaze drifting to the envelope on the table. "I wrote him a letter," he said, his voice hollow. "But I don't think it matters now." Mary stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. "Maybe it does," she said softly. "Maybe it's not too late." Louis shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides. "He doesn't want to hear it. He doesn't care." "How do you know?" Mary asked, her voice firm. "You said you wanted to tell him the truth. You said you wanted to make things right. Well, he's still in town. He hasn't left yet." Louis's eyes snapped to hers. "What do you mean?" "I saw him," Mary said. "He was in the parking lot, sitting in his car. He was just sitting there." Louis's heart pounded. Was Jonathan waiting? Was he hoping Louis would come after him? Louis grabbed the envelope, shoving it into his coat pocket. "Where is he?" Mary's eyes flicked to the hallway. "Still in the parking lot. Go." Louis nodded, his jaw clenched, and pushed past her, his feet moving faster than they had in years. Outside, the air was cold and damp, the ground slick with rain. The sky was a dark, bruised gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy. Louis's breath puffed out in quick, ragged bursts as he hurried across the parking lot, his eyes scanning the rows of cars. There, at the far end of the lot, a single car sat parked under a flickering street lamp. Jonathan's car. The engine was off, the windows fogged up. Inside, Louis could see the silhouette of his son, head bowed, hands gripping the steering wheel. Louis's chest tightened. Was Jonathan crying? Was he regretting coming here? Or was he just waiting to drive away for good? Louis swallowed, his throat dry, and stepped forward. Each step felt like he was dragging 100-pound weight behind him. The envelope burned in his pocket, the words inside screaming to be heard. He reached the car and raised a trembling hand, tapping lightly on the window. Jonathan didn't move. His head remained down, his shoulders tense, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Louis tapped again, harder this time. "Jonathan," he said, his voice shaking. "Please, I need to talk to you." Jonathan's jaw clenched, his eyes still fixed straight ahead. "Go away," he muttered, his voice muffled through the glass. Louis's heart pounded, his breath fogging up the window. "I know I can't fix what I did. I know I can't take back the years I missed. But I need you to hear me out." Jonathan shook his head, his jaw working. What could you possibly say now that would make any difference? Louis's hand dropped to his side, his shoulders slumping. "I wrote you a letter," he said, his voice breaking. "I know that doesn't mean much. I know it's just words on a page, but it's the truth, the whole truth, and I need you to read it." Jonathan finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and glistening. "A letter," he said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "You really think that's enough?" Louis swallowed, the envelope crumpled in his fist. No, he said, his voice raw. It's not enough, but it's all I have. Jonathan's eyes dropped to the envelope, his jaw working. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. The parking lot was silent, the only sound the slow, steady drip of rainwater from the eaves above. Then, slowly, Jonathan opened the car door. He stepped out, his eyes fixed on Louis, his expression a mixture of pain and anger, and something else, something that looked a lot like hope. "Let me see it," Jonathan said, his hand outstretched. Louis's breath hitched. He held out the letter, his hands shaking as Jonathan took it. Jonathan unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the words. With each line, his expression shifted, anger giving way to confusion, confusion giving way to something softer, more vulnerable. When he finished, Jonathan looked up, tears streaming down his face. "You wrote this for me?" Louis nodded, his own tears falling freely now. "Yes, every word." Jonathan's jaw clenched, his eyes searching Louis's face. "Then why didn't you ever say it?" Louis swallowed, his voice breaking. "Because I was a coward, and I thought you wouldn't care." Jonathan let out a shaky breath, the letter still clutched in his hand. "I care," he whispered. "I care more than you know." Louis's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his chest heaving with sobs. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "God, I'm so sorry." Jonathan dropped to his knees, his arms wrapping around his father. The letter fell to the ground, the words smearing under the rain, but it didn't matter. The words had been said. The truth had been heard. And for the first time in decades, Louis finally felt like he could breathe again. Louis and Jonathan remained kneeling in the rain-soaked parking lot, their arms wrapped around each other, the letter crumpled and soggy between them. The world around them seemed to fade away, the nursing home, the flickering street lamp, the distant hum of cars passing by. In that moment, it was just them, father and son, clinging to each other like two drowning men in a vast, unforgiving ocean. Jonathan's shoulders heaved with silent sobs, his face pressed against Louis's shoulder. Louis held him tighter, his own tears mixing with the rain, his fingers gripping the back of Jonathan's shirt as if afraid to let go. For decades, he had convinced himself that this moment would never come, that he had lost Jonathan forever, that the words he had written in countless unsent letters would remain unread, unspoken, forever buried under the weight of his own cowardice. But now, here they were, and the truth, raw and painful and real, hung between them, heavy as a stone. After what felt like hours, Jonathan finally pulled back, swiping a trembling hand across his wet face. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched. He looked down at the letter, now a soggy mess of ink and paper. "I don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "Why now? Why did you wait so long to say all of this?" Louis swallowed, the lump in his throat thick and aching. "I was scared," he said, the words raw and honest. "I was scared you'd hate me, scared that you'd look at me and see the man I really was, a coward, a liar, a failure." Jonathan's jaw twitched, his eyes darkening. "You think not saying anything was better? You think pretending I didn't exist was better than facing me?" Louis dropped his gaze to the ground, the gravel digging into his knees. "No," he whispered. "It was worse. It was so much worse." Jonathan shook his head, his fists clenched. "Do you know what it was like for me? Watching Mom cry every night because you were gone? Asking her why you left and never getting an answer. You think a letter fixes that? You think a bunch of stupid, empty words on paper can change what you did? Louis flinched, the words hitting him like a fist to the gut. He deserved every bit of Jonathan's anger, every accusation, every ounce of pain that was now pouring out like a flood. No, Louis said, his voice breaking. I know it doesn't fix anything, but it's all I have left. It's all I can give you now. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears, his shoulders sagging. I needed you, he said, his voice cracking. All those years, I needed you, and you weren't there. Louis's breath hitched, the ache in his chest spreading like wildfire. I know, he whispered, and I can't ever get those years back. I can't change what I did, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Jonathan stood, his back to Louis, his shoulders tense. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, damp stillness in the air. The sky was a dull, lifeless gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Louis pushed himself to his feet, his knees creaking in protest. His hands shook as he reached for Jonathan, but he stopped short, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. I understand if you can't forgive me, Louis said, his voice trembling. I understand if you never want to see me again. But before you go, I need you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life. And not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted it. Jonathan's shoulders rose and fell with each ragged breath. He said nothing, his eyes fixed on the wet pavement beneath his feet. Louis swallowed, his heart pounding. I know I was a terrible father. I know I wasn't there when you needed me. But I'm here now, Jonathan, and I want to be here, for as long as you'll let me. Jonathan let out a shaky breath, his head hanging low. You don't get it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to forgive you. I don't know how to let go of all the anger. I don't know how to stop hating you. Louis's chest tightened, his eyes stinging with fresh tears. Then don't, he said. Don't forgive me. Don't let go of the anger. Scream at me. Yell at me. Do whatever you need to do. But don't walk away. Please. Not again. Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw clenched so tight Louis could hear his teeth grinding together. I don't know how to do this, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know how to be your son. Louis took a deep breath, the air heavy and cold in his lungs. Then let me teach you, he said. Let me try. Let me make up for everything I missed. Let me show you who I am now, who I've been trying to be. Jonathan opened his eyes, the tears streaming down his face now, unchecked. He turned to face Louis, his eyes dark and haunted, his expression a mixture of pain and longing. I wanted you to come back, he said, his voice a choked whisper. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time something good happened, every time something bad happened, I kept waiting. I kept hoping, and you never came. Louis's throat tightened, the tears blurring his vision. I'm here now, he said, his voice breaking. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, not ever again. Jonathan stared at him, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick, each second a lifetime of unspoken words and unhealed wounds. Then, slowly, Jonathan stepped forward. He reached out, his hands shaking, and grabbed the front of Louis's coat. He buried his face in Louis's chest, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Louis wrapped his arms around his son, holding him tight, his own tears falling freely now. "I'm so sorry," Louis whispered, his lips pressed against Jonathan's damp hair. "God, I'm so sorry." Jonathan clung to him, his fingers digging into Louis's coat, as if afraid he might disappear again. But Louis didn't move. He held his son, his heart breaking and healing all at once. And in that moment, for the first time in decades, Louis finally felt like a father again.